I want to welcome you to another video Drasha. This week's Torah portion is Bo. And we continue with the story of the 10 plagues. The last 3 plagues are described in this week's Torah portion. And the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn in Egypt, has a special significance which we will get to in a moment. But I want to focus in on the 7th Aliyah in today's Torah portion, because indeed the 7th Aliyah contains material that plays a special role in Jewish life. Because in a pair of tefillin, we find these 2 paragraphs from our 7th Aliyah written out. Now let's step back and take a look at tefillin for a minute. In a pair of tefillin, in each of the boxes, both the box that sits on the arm and the one that sits on the head, contain 4 small parchment scrolls. Now, I'm sure most of us associate with tefillin the Shema, because the Shema that we read every day says, "And they shall be a sign on your arm and frontlets between your eyes." And it is understood that that means the words of the Shema. And hence, the first 2 paragraphs of the Shema, the one that begins, Shema Yisrael, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." And it continues, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." And then the second paragraph, which begins with the words, "V'haya im shamoa tishma'u," and "if you will hearken to my commandments," those 2 paragraphs are written out on 2 small pieces of parchment and are placed inside of tefillin. But there are 4 parchments in tefillin. The other 2 paragraphs come from the 7th Aliyah in this week's Torah portion. As a matter of fact, we can say that the entire 7th Aliyah is found in a pair of tefillin, that this 7th Aliyah is cut in half and written on 2 separate pieces of parchment and placed into tefillin. So, what is it that we find in these paragraphs? What is it that we find contained in tefillin? Well, first of all, we find a mitzvah. The mitzvah that the firstborn of our cattle, our flocks, have to be sacrificed to God, and that the firstborn of our sons have to be redeemed. And the Torah tells us specifically that the reason for this mitzvah is because of the 10th plague. That when God killed the firstborn in Egypt, he took possession of the firstborn of Israel. Probably because the firstborn of Israel were saved from this plague. And as a result, they became a possession of God's. And hence we have to sacrifice the firstborn of the animals, and we have to redeem the firstborn of our sons. So here we see a clear connection between this mitzvah of redeeming the firstborn of our sons and the exodus from Egypt, because of the connection to the 10th plague. What else do we find in these paragraphs? Well, we find the mitzvah that says, "V'higadata levincha," and you shall tell your son about these events of the exodus from Egypt. And so really the whole basis, we could say, for the Seder, for the Haggadah, is the commandment that we find in these paragraphs. And I think you can maybe even hear the connection between the words. It says, "V'higadata," and you shall tell. Well, that word higadata is the same root as the word Haggadah, which means the telling. So at the Passover Seder, the book that we read is the Haggadah, the telling. That is the fulfillment of the mitzvah that says, "And you shall tell your son." So that is a second element that we find in these 2 paragraphs. And the third is that it is the comparison to tefillin. It says, and it shall be a sign upon your arm, and a remembrance between your eyes. Now, Rashi explains that when it says it shall be a sign, that means the exodus from Egypt. So that the tefillin are a sign, a symbol, a remembrance of the exodus from Egypt. And as a matter of fact, the Torah goes on to say that you shall remember that God took you out of Egypt with a strong arm. And the Shulchan Aruch tells us that when we put on the arm tefillin, we should really have in mind this idea that God took us out of Egypt with a strong arm. So we see here a very strong connection between these three mitzvahs. One, the redemption of the firstborn, the commandment to teach our children about the exodus from Egypt, and the mitzvah of tefillin, and we see a strong connection between these three to the exodus from Egypt. And it again makes the point which I have emphasized in the past, and that is that the exodus from Egypt, which is the most important event in the Torah, indeed the most important event in all of Jewish history, plays a role in Jewish life like no other event. The exodus from Egypt is part of so many different rituals and observances and holidays in Judaism that, again, I don't think there is any other event that is similar. So besides the three mitzvahs that we've already mentioned that are in our seventh aliyah and are inside the tefillin, so we have the mitzvah of tefillin, the mitzvah of redeeming the firstborn of our sons and sacrificing the firstborn of the animals, and the mitzvah of telling our descendants about this event. But we also see that the exodus from Egypt plays a major role in the observance of Shabbos, for instance. You know, we normally associate with Shabbos with the creation. And certainly in the Ten Commandments, in the book of Exodus, the rationale that is given for Shabbos is that God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh day. So that Shabbos is a reminder, it is connected to our belief that God created the world. But in the version of the Ten Commandments that is given when they are repeated in the book of Deuteronomy, there the connection is made not to the story of creation, but to the exodus from Egypt. And so in the commandment concerning Shabbos of the Ten Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, and you shall do no work, you, your son, your daughter, your servant. And it then says, so that your servant should rest, because you were servants, you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and God took you out of there with a strong arm. And note how the wording in the Ten Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy in connection with the Shabbos is the same wording that we saw in connection with tefillin, that we are to remember that God took us out of Egypt with a strong arm. So that's Shabbos. Then, of course, the Shema itself, when we say the Shema every day, after the first two paragraphs that we've already mentioned, there's a third paragraph. Now, that third paragraph begins with the mitzvah of tzitzit, but it ends with the line, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt to be your God. And actually, when we say the Shema and we read those words, we are fulfilling a different mitzvah. This is not simply the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, of reading the Shema. It is a mitzvah to mention, to remember the exodus from Egypt every day. And the way the tradition safeguarded that we would do this mitzvah is by incorporating this paragraph into the daily Shema that is recited twice every day. So again, we see the connection between the Shema and the exodus from Egypt, the Shabbos and the Exodus from Egypt, and I haven't even mentioned yet the holiday of Passover, which clearly is a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt. And it says, Man Cherutenu, that Passover is the time of our liberation. So we see how this event is so central to all of these different practices. And the fact is, I can find no other parallel. And to say, what are the candidates? What would be the other events that maybe we should find in all kinds of different Jewish observances and practices and holidays? Well, how about the entry into the land of Israel or the conquest of the land of Israel? I mean, to the best of my knowledge, we have no ritual or holiday that commemorates that event. How about the building of the temple? Well, here we do have Hanukkah. Hanukkah clearly is a holiday that commemorates the dedication, perhaps more correctly, the rededication of the temple. Of course, it's really the temple, the second temple that was rededicated, that we are commemorating on Hanukkah. But clearly we can say, yes, there is a connection between Hanukkah and the dedication of the temple. But I know of no other ritual or holiday. We could say the destruction of the temple is, of course, lamented and commemorated on Tisha B'Av. How about the event of the revelation at Mount Sinai? Again, nothing could be more central, right, than the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. And yet, beside the holiday of Shavuot, I don't see that this event is incorporated into the daily practices of Judaism in the same way that the Exodus from Egypt is. And so the Exodus from Egypt is a very unique event, and it is part of almost everything that we do in Judaism. And so therefore we should bear in mind that when we put on tefillin or when we see someone wearing tefillin, we should remember that part of that mitzvah is that it should be a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos. I hope everyone is staying safe. And I hope that these comments perhaps will provide you with some material to think about if you have a chance to read the Torah portion of this week. Good Shabbos.